Bungalow Bill here. Now, the thumbnail was clearly a visual gag. So, let's talk about what this tutorial is about. It's about what I think is the most basic thing in any physics-based vehicle building game, particularly in real life as well, if you build model aircraft or that sort of thing. And if you've played from the depths for any amount of time, you will be familiar with this concept. A coupled control is when one control for your vehicle, these being the rotational controls, yaw, pitch, and roll, or the translational controls, forward, back, strafe, and hover, attempting to control one of these actually controls another one as well. We'd refer to those as being coupled. And when your vehicle is AI controlled, it can compensate for this by correcting using the other control if available. However, it will still cause problems, as we will see. This is a boat. In particular, this boat has coupled controls. If you've watched my Live with Neater series, you will have seen that as the case. In particular, the forward-back control is coupled with the pitch control. If you see these propellers, the thrust line is under the center of mass. This means that when this vehicle is accelerating, it produces a torque, a net torque, which causes it to pitch upwards. When you try to think about these coupled controls, and usually the rotational ones being coupled, in this case pitch, are the main ones to look at, the best way to think of them is to look at a torque balance on the craft and to make sure that the net torque is zero. That's to think of it as this craft being a seesaw, and to make sure that when all of the forces are applied onto that seesaw, the seesaw won't move. Of course, a seesaw needs a pivot, and for craft, you have to think of where the pivot is. There is a physics trick for why you can use the pivot that you can use, and this is that if the net forces on a rigid body are zero, the torque will be the same regardless of the point, or regardless of the axis that you calculate the torque around. When this craft is accelerating, you may think, well, the net forces are not zero, and you would be correct, but there is a cheat that you can do. You can apply what you call inertial forces, which, if you say the force on an object is equal to the mass times acceleration, well, now you apply an inertial force, which is the opposite mass times acceleration. When you add this into the rest of the forces, by definition, of course, the net forces are now zero, and you will receive the exact same torque regardless of where you calculate it. So I could calculate the torque here, and imagine that the axis is me shooting laser beams out of my eyeballs, and that's where the vehicle will be pivoting around. So, I could apply the torque around here, I could apply it around here, I could apply it around here, but of course we'll choose the center of mass, and we'll choose that so that we can disregard the inertial forces, which we just introduced. We will still have to calculate the drag forces. This vehicle is slow enough and dominated by inertial forces that I don't really care about the drag forces too much. But we can put the pivot for our imaginary seesaw here, and now the thrust is coming down here and pushing one side of my seesaw. There is nothing pushing on the other side of my seesaw, which means it will be unbalanced. And let's watch the effects of that. This is even worse if the craft is AI controlled, because the ramp-up speed for the motors is even faster. Now, obviously, this behavior is suboptimal. So, the theme of this video is decoupling coupled controls. So, what can we do about these controls in order to make them no longer coupled? Well, unfortunately, there isn't that much, and the issue here is that the center of mass for this boat is above the waterline. This means that no matter where I put these propellers, as long as they're in the water, they're going to be applying their force under the center of mass, and they're going to be giving us some issues. There are things that we could do about this, because, for example, extra configuration gives yaw and pitch angles. I could adjust the pitch angle of the thrust so that it comes up in a line through the center of mass. This will mean that we will have another coupled control, right? Because when I apply a forward force, well, now I'm applying an upward force. so my forward, back, and my hover controls will be coupled. This is not nearly as bad as coupling the rotational axes, and is really a decent solution. I'd have to do some tests on this to figure out if it'll cause issues with lifting the propellers out of the water and losing thrust that way. In the campaign playthrough, if you're watching, I simply just cut down the thrust output of these propellers to about half. And that's enough. It makes it so this boat doesn't flip anymore, despite the fact that the controls are still coupled. It does, however, mean it's slow. It only moves about 20 meters per second, whereas it has the power to move much faster than that. So, in the campaign mode, I have this vehicle set up to turn through differential thrust. So, this propeller would go back, this propeller would go forwards, it would turn right. Right now, this vehicle isn't set up to do that. So how else could I make this vehicle turn? Well, what people usually do, and if you're not on the alpha test branch, you will not have the 4x1 rudder pivot available to you, but I'm still going to use it anyway. What other people would do, when you're getting into this game, you say, okay, we'll just put a rudder in. So let's put a rudder in. If you've played this game for a bit, the issues that we're going to run into now are already horrifyingly obvious to you, but that is not going to stop me from investigating them. So let's get our speed up about 20 meters per second, and let's turn hard to starboard. Now we're rolling quite badly. It's not terrible, but it's not great either. So right now we have our yaw and our roll quite coupled. And if this boat was faster, this could cause us some serious issues. And let's look at the issues for this in terms of force balance. So from our principles before, this would be our roll axis coming from my eyeballs through the vehicle. And when we try to yaw, we apply a force in this direction, which is unbalanced around the roll axis. And that causes our vehicle to roll when we try to yaw. So what can we do about this? Well, one thing would be to just create an opposite force that goes through the same point from the point of view that we're looking at the roll axis from. So to turn in a direction, this rudder will go in the opposite direction from this rudder. And from this perspective, those forces will cancel each other out. So let's take a look at what happens. Let's bring this boat back up to speed. And let's go hard over. So we don't see the control coupling that we saw before. However, we have another issue. And that question is not one of control coupling, but one of redundancy. Which, let's pretend that this is a much more high-performance boat, and without these rudders being decoupled, it would capsize. Now the issue is, if a shot comes in and blows off one of these two rudders, our controls are now coupled, and the boat will capsize if it yaws too hard. And the only thing worse than a single system that, if taken out, takes out the entire craft's combat capabilities is having two systems, either one of which being destroyed will destroy the vehicle's combat capabilities. It's being half as redundant as if I just had one rudder that was decoupled. However, in the circumstance, really the only thing I can do, because I have the same issue as before, that my center of mass is just above the waterline, is I can either use custom control surfaces to make an air rudder, sort of like an Everglades boat or that sort of thing, or I can just not worry about it, which is really the best that I can do in this case. With this vehicle being very light, very high out of the water, being made out of wood, but me still wanting to use water thrust and water controls just to make it a boat, they're just inherent design flaws that I have to accept that my controls are coupled, I have to understand the drawbacks that causes, and mitigate them and understand the costs that I'm paying. However, this vehicle could just be designed differently so that it doesn't have these drawbacks. And let me load in another boat that's designed differently and does not suffer from these drawbacks for a comparison. So here's a vehicle whose dynamics I considered more carefully and spent way longer building her in the designer mode as opposed to the previous vehicle that you've seen, which I built in quite a bit of haste in the campaign mode during a playthrough. So what about this vehicle makes her dynamics better than the previous vehicles so that we don't have these coupled control issues? Well, one, I didn't have to make her entirely out of wood, which means that she's denser and rides a bit lower in the water, so when I look at my thrust line, it just about goes through the center of mass. And my yaw is controlled here as well, which means that I don't have coupled roll and yaw either. So why is the center of mass so low in this vehicle to give us these capabilities? And that's primarily because everything that's heavy in this vehicle is just about as low as I could get it. Some of these guns are raised to be super firing, but beyond that, they sit very low. All of the ammo is resting up against the lower hull, and where I can, I really just put every heavy component as close to the bottom of this hull as possible to really try to get the center of mass underwater. And you'll see that all the way across, that these are just mostly the heaviest components I can find, and all mounted as close to the center of mass as I could. There are some exceptions. These ammo storage compartments could be slightly better distributed lower, but the center of mass pretty much lines up where I want it to be, so I'm pretty happy with the way things are layered now. And it still doesn't expose too much of a problem to heat torpedoes or high explosive torpedoes because the lower armor for this deck is 3 meters thick. And apparently I had some issues fixing some mirror mode problems that I had. If you saw those when downloading this craft from the workshop and didn't tell me about them, well, shame on you. But they are fixed now, so I'll be re-uploading this craft with those mirror mode problems fixed, if you have been using this craft in the past. Anyway, that's all for this tutorial. I hope you've enjoyed watching, and I hope to see you in the future.